All right, good afternoon, everyone. Our guest speaker today is Dennis Hessel. I think a lot of you know him, and he's going to be talking about a hobby he picked up in retirement, beekeeping. So please welcome Dennis.
Thank you. Like Brian said, I recognize a lot of faces out there. I retired in 2017 from the Bank of Edwardsville, and I've always been interested in science and biology, and there was a public announcement in the Intelligencer that talked about an upcoming beekeeping class. So I thought, well, what the heck? So I went and spent a Saturday morning learning about bees, and when I walked out of there, I was hooked. So right away, I got 2 hives. I'm a woodworker, so I made my own equipment, my own hive bodies and all that. And that was 7 or 6 years ago. So now I have 5 hives. It's very interesting. You probably can't see it from there, but if you look at this slide real close, some of the bees coming in have pollen on their legs, and this is slow motion, but you think they're so graceful, but you'll see them coming in and crashing into the boards or coming down and hard landing on the entrance there. So basically there's 3 subspecies of bees that the United States beekeepers keep, or they keep us, I should say. There's Italians, Carnolians, and Caucasians. And each bee has its own traits, whether they build up fast in the spring with a lot of bees, whether they build a lot of comb or honey, or make a lot of honey. Some are docile, some are really aggressive. You get in that hive and they just want to sting you. I have Italians. They've been very good for me. They're very docile. I've gotten a lot of honey out of them. They're pretty disease resistant. There is a varroa mite that came to the United States in 1980, and that's our biggest problem right now, is controlling that mite. That mite brings diseases into the hives. So we have to test periodically. We take 300 bees and put it in a jar with some alcohol, and we wash it, and then we hold it up and count the number of mites that fall off the bees, and that tells us how bad they're infested or not. And then we have different treatments that we use. Let's see, page down, where are you? Okay. So there's 3 parts to the bee. There's the head that has the eyes on it, the antenna, the jaw, the tongue. And then there's the thorax in the middle that has the wings and the legs coming out of it. And then there's the abdomen. That's where all the internals are, and the reproductive organs for the queen bee and the sting. You got to realize that in a beehive, it's dark. You know, the only light that's coming in is that little opening down here at the bottom. So everything is done by pheromones and smells in contact with each other in the hive. And the bees are a social insect, and they're sometimes called a superorganism because they all depend upon each other to survive. So one of the things right here, you see that little hook that says antenna cleaner? Well, since they use their antenna to sense everything, they take that hook and they'll rub it across their antenna to clean debris off, or like kind of blow their nose or whatever. And then so they can smell and see what's going on. Most people know bees because of the sting. So I'll cover that real quick. This is the sting that comes out of a bee. A male bee or a drone bee does not have a stinger. Only the females have stingers. The female worker bees has a barb on their stinger. So when they sting you, it sticks in your skin. A queen bee does not have a barb. So when she stings you, and she very rarely does, she just flies off. But when a worker bee stings you, it sticks in your body. The venom sacs pump venom into your body, so it makes it itch and burn. And when they fly away, they pull out their insides and that bee dies. So when a bee stings you, they're defending their hive and they're giving up their life for the hive. With the queen bee, there's only one queen in a hive. And if a queen is born or hatched and it finds other queens in there, it will use its stinger to kill the bee either in the cell that it's growing in or that's just roaming around the hive. So that's all a queen uses her stinger for. So if you get stung, you don't want to pinch at it and try to pull it out. You want to take a credit card or a pocket knife or your fingernail or something, and you want to drag it across there and scrape it out. Because if you grab it, you're pressing those venom sacs and it's pumping more venom into your body. So in a hive, there's 3 bees. There's a worker bee, a queen bee, and a drone bee. So we'll start with the drone bee. He's the guy on the right. He's got nice big eyes because all he does, his whole purpose in life is to mate with the queen. He goes out every afternoon and he flies off to an area that's called a drone congregation area, where drones, for whatever reason, collect in that area. And from year to year, they'll always be in the same area. And you got to remember, they're not passing this on word of mouth or teaching their youngs how to do this. This just all happens through science and nature. And so the drones will go out there flying around, waiting for a queen to fly through, and they'll mate with her in the air. And she'll mate with up to 15 drones at a time, or in her mating flight. She has a organ in her body called a spermatheca that she stores the sperm in. A queen will live for up to 5 years. So she stores all the sperm and eggs that she needs for 5 years. When the drone bee gets done mating with the queen, it falls away and it dies. So a drone lives from 90 to 120 days unless he finds a virgin queen, and then he's dead right away. He doesn't have any other function in the hive. He can't feed himself. He can't collect pollen. He can't collect honey or nothing. The other bees feed him. So in the fall, when the weather turns bad and we're going into winter, all the worker bees will kick all the drone bees out for them to die because they don't want them in there living off their stores for the winter. So a drone, he's a life of Riley, but it's a short life and a brutal one. So for the queen is the layer of the hive. She lays anywhere from 500 to 2,000 eggs a day. That's all she does. She doesn't feed herself. She doesn't clean herself. The workers do all that for her. So again, her sole purpose is just to lay eggs. She gives off a pheromone, and that pheromone is smelled by the other bees, and that's what keeps the hive together. When the bees go out flying, they do what's called an orientation flight based on where the sun is, so they know where their hive is. But when they come back, they can still smell the pheromone of that queen, and they know to go into that hive. If a queen, for whatever reason, leaves the hive or dies, the worker bees will know within 15 minutes that they no longer have a queen. They're not a queen-right hive, and they will start to make a new queen. And the way they make a queen is they feed it royal jelly. And in the next slide, we'll talk about that a little more, but they feed it royal jelly, and that's all they feed it. They don't stop and feed it bee bread. They feed it just royal jelly, and that's what makes that egg develop into a queen. So the worker bee, she does all the work in the hive. There's anywhere between 4,000 and upwards of 60,000 worker bees in a hive during the summer months. And during their life, they live for about 5 or 6 weeks. During their life, they have different things that they do. And again, this is one of those things that it's like, who told me that on day 4, I'm supposed to do this? It just happens. And the other interesting thing is how the scientist or whatever figured this all out. You know, they marked a bee and watched it. Okay, what's it doing on day 1 and what's doing on day whatever. A worker bee will make 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in their lifetime. So this 1 pound jar of honey, it took 777 bees to make that. They visited 2 million flowers, and they flew 50,000 miles to make that 1 pound of honey. Make a pound of beeswax, it takes 7 to 8 pounds of honey. A hive will make up to 100 pounds or more per year. So we take some of it, but we have to leave some of it behind for them to survive off of the winter because they don't migrate. They hibernate inside, or not really hibernate, go to sleep, but they form a cluster and they vibrate their bodies to generate a heat, and they'll keep that cluster at 75 degrees all winter, no matter how cold it is outside. And the bees on the outside work to the inside to get warm, and the bees on the inside work to the outside to protect the hive. And the queen's at the very center of that. So then they work their way up through the hive all winter long, eating the honey stores that we've left for them to survive off of. So here's a picture of a hive itself. You can see the queen on the left there. She's got her abdomen down in a cell where she's laying an egg. These are worker bees here. Here's a drone with its great big beady eyes. So when you open up a hive, the first thing you want to do is find the queen so you don't kill her, or what we call roller. When you put the frame back in, you might roll her between the hives and kill her. So the first thing you do is you try to find a hive. But when you pull out a frame, you're looking at 3,000 bees on that frame, and they're just all moving around and they're buzzing at you and all that other stuff, and you have to find the queen. So sometimes this queen's not marked, but we'll take a marker and we'll put a red dot or a yellow dot or a green dot on her thorax, and then it makes it easier to find it because it just stands out inside the hive. So the life stages of a bee, it's kind of like the chicken and the egg, what came first. So what we're going to start with is we got a mated queen in a hive with frames with some worker bees. So the queen bee, she'll lay an egg. It's an egg for 3 days. After it hatches, the worker bees, it becomes a larva, and the worker bees will feed it royal jelly for 3 days. After 3 days, it starts feeding it bee bread, which is a combination of pollen and honey. And then on day 10, they'll cap over that cell with wax, and that larva's gotten bigger and becomes a pupa. It makes a cocoon inside there, and it metamorphoses from a larva to an adult bee. A queen bee, from beginning to end, it takes 16 days. For a worker bee, it's 21 days. And for a drone, it's 26 days. So when we plan activities in the hive, we have to kind of factor that into everything, because you can raise queens if you want, but you got to have plenty of drones around so that when the queen hatches, there's something for that queen to mate with. So we track all that and follow all that. The queen gives off the pheromone that keeps the bees at the hive, but the workers are the ones that decide everything. If there's no honey coming in or nectar coming in or very little pollen, we call that a dearth. And what they'll do is they'll stop making cells, and they'll stop cleaning cells so the queen doesn't lay more eggs, because the last thing we need is more mouths to feed, so we'll kind of shut the hive down. When there's a good strong flow of nectar and pollen, they'll make all the cells they can. They'll take and make more wax and make more comb. So there's plenty of space there for the bees to live in. Bees functions, their whole purpose in life is to survive through the winter, put up enough stores to survive through the winter, and reproduce. And the way they reproduce is they swarm. When you see a clump of bees on a tree or whatever, and I got some slides of that later, that's how a colony divides. The queen will take some of the bees and she'll leave with them, and she'll leave some of the bees behind, and they'll develop a new queen for that hive. So now 2 hives become, or 1 hive becomes 2. I started with 2 hives last year. I've got 5 now because they swarmed 3 times on me, and I caught the swarms off the trees. So when a bee's born, you heard the saying, busy as a bee. As soon as a worker bee or a queen bee is born, all they do is to work the rest of their life. The drone, he's just laying back and he's eating the stores and he's out flying around looking to have a good time. But you can see here the bees, they chew their way through the wax capping and they come out. Here's another one that's just opening them up. And then when they come out, they're real furry. And their wings are folded up and all that. So if you're a worker bee, or if you're a queen bee, you hang around for about 48 hours. Your body matures and you go out on your maiden flight or mating flight. You go out, you might mate 2 or 3 days, you come back, and then you stay in the hive the rest of your life unless your hive swarms, then you'll leave with the swarm. If you're a worker bee, the first thing you do, you're 1 to 2 days old, you go back and you clean out the cells. You take the cocoons out of there, you clean them out, and they call it polishing the cell so that the queen will lay another egg in that cell, or it might be used for honey storage or pollen storage. They also walk around on top of the brood and help keep the brood warm so that it'll survive. At 3 to 5 days old, you feed the older larvae. So these white look like grub looking things, those are the older larvae, and they're fed bee bread, and the bee bread, which is the honey and the pollen. When you're 6 to 11 days old, you have a gland in your head that produces the chemical that makes up the royal jelly. So when you get 6 to 11 days old, you stop feeding the older bees and you go to feeding the younger bees. And in here, you can see the larvae at all different stages and sizes. This one here is probably about 3 days old, whereas this one here and that one there is maybe only a day or 2 old. So your job then is to feed the young larvae. 12 to 17 days old, the glands on the bottom of your abdomen have matured and you produce wax. It takes 7 to 8 pounds of honey to make a pound of wax. So they go around and they take these flakes off their abdomen and they use their legs to pass them up to their mouth, and they use their mandibles to mash it and work with it. And then from that, they make the cells and they put the cappings on the cells. When you're 12 to 17 days old, you start transporting nectar from the outside. So the foragers go out and collect the nectar. They bring it back to the hive. They regurgitate it to another bee who takes it and puts it in their honey stomach. They add enzymes to it. They take it deeper into the hive. They regurgitate it again. Another bee picks it up, adds some more enzymes to it, and then they pack it into a cell and store it. Then they fan it with their wings to get the moisture out of the honey. And when the moisture is at the right content, that's when they'll lay a capping of beeswax over the top, and that's their stores. So this is a frame of honey and brood. They usually keep the honey by the brood. So this is all brood, this yellow stuff. That's capped larvae. And this white stuff with the real pretty white cappings on it is the honey. And it's right there next door and handy for them. So when you're 18 to 21 days, your job is to guard the hive and take dead bees out of the hive. So bees are very opportunistic. If they need honey and there's a dearth going on and they can get in another honey hive, they'll rob that hive and they'll take all that honey, especially if it's a weaker colony. So these guys, their job is to stand guard at the front door and not allow any bees that don't belong in there to come in and rob their honey. The other thing they do is on the picture right here, they're doing what we call fanning. They stand on the entrance board and they flap their wings to draw air out of the hive to help cool it and also to spread the pheromone of the queen in the air. So then when you're 22 to 34 days old, you got a couple jobs you can do. You can become a pollen collector. So on the legs of this bee, they have the pollen collected. A bee will go out to collect pollen and it'll visit between 50 and 100 flowers before it returns back to the hive. They take it in and then they pack it into a cell. When a bee collects pollen, if it starts on dandelions, it'll stay on dandelions until it can't find any more dandelions. Then it'll switch to something else, like, like the black locust trees with the white flowers in the spring. Once they start on black locust, they stay on black locust until it's done blooming. They don't go out, I'll stop and get some black locust pollen and I'll go get some dandelion pollen. They don't do that. Also on 22 to 34 days, they go out and collect water. They need water to survive. And they also use the water inside the hive, again, through evaporation. They'll flap their wings to evaporate it to help cool or keep the temperature inside the hive down. They also collect propolis. It's a real sticky substance. They collect it on their legs. It's like tree resin and sap. And they use that and they'll glue all this hive body together. So you actually have to take a tool to pry it to get it open. It's really sticky, especially when it's warm outside. It is also antibacterial, so it also keeps germs and things like that in the hive down. Then they can also collect nectar. So they have a proboscis that they stick down into the flowers. They can't get nectar from all flowers because of the length of their proboscis. Some of the nectar reserves are so far down that they can't reach them. So there's certain plants that the bees can live off of. So what I brought with me is a Langstroth hive. It was developed by a minister, Reverend Lorenzo Langstrom, in 1852. Up to that time, people kept bees in logs and baskets. And you've probably seen a picture of a skep. It looks like an upside down basket that's woven with rope and all that. Well, with those hives, to extract the honey, you destroyed the hive and the bees had to start all over again. So Mr. Langstroth, he measured everything. He watched them all. And they talk about size matters. Well, with bees, it's 3/8 of an inch. If the gap between the frames or any opening is more than 3/8 of an inch, they'll fill that in with what we call burr comb. It's just comb that's not used for anything. If it's any less than that, they'll fill it up with propolis. So everything in here is designed so there's 3/8 inch differences between it. So what we do is we put on our veil so we don't get stung. And you're going to come help Steve. And we have our smoker going. And we wear gloves. It depends on the day and what I'm doing, what I wear. But you have your smoker. We use pine needles, cardboard, the stuff that eggs come in, the cardboard crate, anything like that. And so what you do is you take your hive tool and you pop up the corner a little bit and you give it a couple of puffs of smoke, and then you give it a couple puffs here, and then you wait for a minute or two. Then you get into your hive. So this is called a migratory cover, or the outside cover. It keeps the weather out of the hive. Inside we have an inner cover, so that when you open up the top cover, you're not staring at a bunch of bees. And there's a notch in here that they can get out. That's 3/8 of an inch deep. And then there's an opening here in the top to let air circulate through the hive. Or we can also put a jar of feed on top of here that they can come up and get the liquid feed. And then there's 8-frame hives and 10-frame hives. This is a 10-frame hive. I use 8-frame hives. But then inside, we have these frames. So there's a frame, and then this is called foundation. So it can either be plastic or beeswax. And it's got the hexagon shapes of the bee cells on it. And that encourages the bees to draw out those cells. So then when they do, you get a frame like this. This is a honey frame. I extracted the honey off of it. I leave the wax behind for them. So then they'll fill it up a lot faster. You can stack. This is a deep box, and then we have another box that's like 6 3/4 inches. And so usually you have 2 deeps, and then you put your honey supers or the smaller ones on top, and then that's the honey that we take off. So the first time around here is usually late June, early July when we have a honey crop. So we'll take it all off, you uncap it, put it in a spinner, and centrifugal force extracts all the honey, and then you put them back in there, and then they'll fill it up for you again. But we got to make sure that we leave enough in there for them to survive through the winter. So there's some equipment, pictures of the equipment. And so how can you help? Well, the bees are under a lot of stress from environmental reasons, climate change, pesticides, insecticides, lack of environment anymore. People are plowing stuff up, or everybody's yard has to be pretty green and no yellow dandelions. The first thing a beekeeper looks for in the spring is a dandelion, because we know once we see a dandelion, the bees are starting to, the queen's starting to lay again and build up the hive. So don't use chemicals in your yard if you can help it. Leave the dandelions, plant some flowers. If you find a swarm, these are swarms, don't do anything with them. Call a beekeeper. Go to stclairbeekeepers.com. We have a whole list of people in the area that'll come out and take that swarm for you. That's $200 on the bush. To buy a package of bees is $200. So if I can come out and get a swarm and get the queen, I just saved myself $200, and I've saved the bees also.
How do you take it?
Well, I had an apple tree, sort of like this picture up at the top, up here, and it was in my backyard. I got a box like this with frames in it. I put on my hood, my gloves, and I just reached into that clump of bees and grabbed a handful of them and put them in the box. And luckily I grabbed the queen, because I got it on my iPad at home. But it just shows the bees are marching down the tree in single line right into the door of the hive, because I had the queen. If I didn't have the queen, they would have stayed on the tree. So you just get them like that, or you can get a bee brush. It's a real soft horsehair brush. You can brush them in there. You can also use a bee vac. So it's just a bucket that's a double bucket with holes in it, and you hook the shop vac up to it so the bees can't get sucked into the vacuum sweeper, and you just suck them out of the tree. Now, another swarm I had this year was on the top of an apple tree. So that's how I had to get them out of there. I climbed up on a ladder and took the vacuum sweeper, swept them all out. They were in that bucket. I took the bucket over and dumped it in the hive. And then a couple of days later, I had to go back to make sure I had the queen. But if you see a swarm, don't spray it with water or gasoline or insecticide or anything like that. Call a beekeeper and they'll be glad to come out and get them for you. There's also a thing called what we call a cutout. When the bees go out on a swarm, they send a scout out, and he's trying to find a new home for everybody. So before they find that new home, they're going to land on a tree or a car or a swing set or whatever until the scouts come back and say, hey, I found a new home. And when they come back, then they'll go to that new home and they'll set up shop. Now, before they left, they gorged themselves on honey, because they're packing light. They're not bringing any brood with them. They're not bringing any wax with them. They're not bringing any pollen. All they can bring is the honey that they've sucked out of the other hive. So they're anxious to go. When they find a new home, man, they're going to build comb like crazy. The bees are going to be coming and going nonstop because they're going to be out collecting more stores. So with a cutout, it's when it's in a building or something like that. And a beekeeper will come out and do that for you also. The only thing is they're not going to pay to repair anything. You know, if they have to cut a hole in the drywall or whatever to get to it, they'll be glad to do that. But with the understanding that it's up to you to fix that. But they'll take all those bees out. They'll take all that honey out. They might give you some of that honey, and then they'll set up a new hive with that. So can you see the queen? Right there. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
You say we goes out, hangs out with the drones for 2-3 days? And then
A day or two at the most.
day or two, and then
Right.
happen frequently, or you said it's
Just at one time. And when she goes back to the hive, she doesn't leave unless they swarm.
And then how can we consumers, like, you know, we want to buy fresh, real honey versus
Okay.
not real honey? So
Find a local beekeeper. A lot of the honey that you see that's real cheap at the store, that's been processed and watered down, or a lot of it will come from China.
corn syrup or whatever.
Right.
So, but I've seen it where it's like butter, you know, real thick.
That's called cream honey. What they'll do is they'll mix it, like whip it, and it'll make it like that, like almost a spread. The other thing is honey never goes bad. It'll crystallize, and you can see the sugar crystals in it and all that, but if you put it in some warm water and let it sit and stir it, it'll come right back to honey. Honey goes way back in Egyptian times. They used honey to pay their taxes. So they've been collecting honey and keeping bees that long. Uh-huh.
What about wasps? What is the difference between like wasps? Like, I know, I have like spray bills and stuff.
Oh.
Like, I'm just curious. Like, I know these are like a different category.
Right.
Like, from a safety perspective, like, what's the
Okay, a wasp can sting you more than once because it doesn't have a barbed stinger. It'll just keep stinging you.
are they bad? Do they help
There's some wasps that are good, that'll kill the tomato caterpillar larva. They'll sting that and kill that. I don't know a whole lot about what the different species of wasps do, but them and bumblebees especially, you know, they'll just keep stinging you, and they live in the ground. They don't, like a honeybee, it tries to survive through the winter. With a bumblebee or a wasp or that, all they do is the queen survives during the winter. So then in the spring, then she starts all over again. Whereas with the honeybee, they all survive because they depend on each other to survive. Right, the drones are history. They make a whole new batch. Yeah.
So the worker bees, when they're out collecting pollen, how is the range away from pollen?
They'll go up to 2.5 miles from the hive to collect honey. I've got another picture on my iPad. It's really neat. The sun's going down, so the sun's behind my hive, and the bees will come out of the hive. They'll go up 7 or 8 foot, and then they go right over my house. And you can just see them coming and going in that sunlight. It's really neat. Mark?
You talked about bumblebees, or you didn't mention yellow jackets. So not all bees are honey.
Correct.
Only
This is Apis mellifera is their genetic name, and they're the only bee that produces honey, or it's only insect that produces food that man eats is a honeybee.
so, and the 3 types of Italian, Caucasian, I believe.
And Carnelian.
So are those the original species of the Cape?
Correct.
Have any native?
No, there were no native bees in the United States. They were all brought over from Europe. The Caucasians are from the Caucasus Mountains. The Italians are from Italy. And there's also a Russian bee that some people take. They're supposed to be winter hardy, but they're kind of aggressive. So there's not as many of those around. The first bee that was brought to the United States was called a black bee. I don't remember what country it came from, but that was popular back then. Go ahead, Larry. Larry?
Is there much danger of these large killer bees that supposedly invading the country?
So far, they haven't come up this far north because of the climate. They can't stand the cold winters. So we hope they stay down in Texas, the Africanized bees.
With a lot to take care of these, is that a missed competition or?
Yeah, no. Again, because of the varroa mites and other pests and disease, it takes more now than it did before. In the 80s, you used to go out and buy a beehive and just set it out in your yard, forget about it. I have to get into the bees about every 10 to 14 days. One of the things you have to do is watch to make sure that they have room to expand in the hive, that there's empty frames in there for them, or if not, you got to put another box on top. Because if they get too crowded, that signals for the workers to make a new queen, and we're going to let them swarm. So anything we can do to give them enough room, that keeps them from swarming. Or if we see a swarm cell started in a hive, we'll knock it off with our framing tool, just knock it out so that they can't make a queen out of that. And it tends to keep them in the hive then. So you have to do that. And you have to check for disease, American foul brood, European foul brood. American foul brood, we actually have to take our hives out and burn them in a pit. You can't save any of it. You have to take bees and everything and put it in the pit and burn it because it's that bad of a disease. With European foul brood, you have to go to a veterinarian and get a prescription from them to treat your bees.
Dennis, are you able to stick around for a couple minutes?
Sure,
for questions?
sure.
Okay.
I'm here as long as you want.
Some people have to get back to work. so
Okay.
Go ahead and do 50-50. Jennifer, if you want to bring it up. Dennis, on behalf of the home nursery, this is not speaking. This is for you.